Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for coming, for dialing in, for digitally appearing in this wonderful and inspiring space today. Big well done to Impact Summit before we start for pulling this off. Such a wonderful use of technology and exploration of what can be done even in difficult times. I'm going to dive into the presentation at just a moment. One thing to say is that there will be a Q&A at the end. You should see on your screens a Q&A function, and if you have questions, please do type them in as we go along, and I'll address them in the sort of last 5 to 10 minutes of the session at the end. What we won't be using is the chat. So the Q&A is there for anything you'd like to bring up towards the end of the session. All right, wonderful. Let us get cracking. Good. Here is the topic for today: 5 mistakes purpose-led businesses must avoid to nail communications. I was lucky enough to come up to the Impact Summit last year, 2019, and then I presented on the topic, don't go live on your purpose campaign until you've answered these 5 questions. And in the spirit of recycling my presentation questions, I thought I'd go for a similar approach this time. But as a key difference this year, obviously we've just been through and are still going through quite a remarkable period of change. And I really wanted to reflect on what does that mean for climate change communications going forward. We're in a crisis, we're dealing with complexity, uncertainty. Well, we can see all the echoes. What can we learn here? And really, I've got to move this year from the sort of more tactical approach we were talking to you about in 2019 to more strategic thinking. What is it that we need to get right so that we don't trip up when we try and communicate and be part of the solution on climate change? Throughout the presentation, there's going to be some case studies, some thought leaderships, all sorts of example. You can find links to all of those on Twitter. If you follow me at Ollie Lauder, you'll see a post there that can link you all through. And I recommend giving a little follow to Futerra too, who've got all sorts of wonderful, exciting things, webinars, opportunities, the latest thing in sustainability and purpose. Who are we? We're a change agency. This is our mission. We're here to make sustainability so desirable it becomes normal. What do we mean by that? Well, sustainability is a big bucket. Anything and every effort to make the world a better place. But what's key for us is this sense of a desirable future, something that people are going to run towards, rather than something that's so overwhelming and scary that they feel compelled to run away from. Here we are, 4 main offices, but we've got clients all over the world and projects impacting on all sorts of people and places. We work with wonderful disruptive NGOs. We work with amazing certification bodies changing their industries, some household brands, some parent companies, the complex multinationals, impactful local disruptors. We love them all. Here are a few numbers. Let's get into the presentation now and really start to think about the reflections of the times we're in and the challenges ahead. 30 years. We are now the same distance from 1990 as we are to 2050. Can you, yeah, okay, we're hearing okay. So 30 years from, same distance from 1990 as we are to 2050. 30 years ago, Vanilla Ice were topping the pop charts, and in 30 years' time, we need to have found a way to cool our planet. Sorry about the pun and the reference there. Another thing to focus on and to think about that really got me going with this presentation is this disease that we are struggling with collectively. 1 to 3% is the mortality rate for those who are unfortunate enough to catch the novel coronavirus. A remarkably low mortality rate for a pandemic that's affecting our world. But nonetheless, something that has had fantastic consequences for both our society, our environment, and our economy. And then also 50-50. This is the chance that we're giving ourselves. In many of the targets and goals and metrics we use to chart a path from here to a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree future, most of those models are based on only giving us a 50-50 chance of actually hitting that target. And the final thing that was in my mind when constructing this survey, this presentation, was a survey done by Edelman that found that a third of people during the coronavirus have persuaded a family member or a friend of theirs not to buy from a brand who they felt hadn't shown up well to contribute to this crisis. So it's no doubt, there's no question that we have a real challenge ahead. Not only do we need to act on climate change, but we need to get the communications right to bring everybody with us and give us a fighting chance. We are, so to speak, at a crossroads. The normal that we are familiar with, that we are used to, has felt like a decline, a sense of things fraying at the edges, a system unable to cope. We're at a moment now where we have some choice about where we go next. We can double down on the things that have got us this far and accelerate ourselves into disaster. We can put bandages on, patching up some of the problems we face while being blind to the real causes and simply delay the inevitable. Or we can be bright. We can be smart about the challenge we face and level up, move up to a big payoff, a new and better way of organizing the world we live in. To get there, though, we must communicate and we must acknowledge this simple truth that good ideas don't sell themselves. If we're to get people to come with us, to act, to move towards a sustainable future, we need to bring them along and communicate well. So let's think about what we can learn from the coronavirus and the recent couple of months, and let's dig down into some of those mistakes and what you can do to avoid them. Number one, what do we see over the last couple of months? We've seen all sorts of businesses try and contribute to the crisis response. We've seen those giving away their products and services or giving healthy discounts to frontline workers. We've seen others try and leverage their manufacturing capabilities to produce some of the products and tools needed to fight this disease. We've seen those who perhaps can't help more practically add their voice to the government message, with Paddy Power here saying, give our NHS better odds, stay at home this weekend. But we've also seen a few companies do little more than fiddle about with their logo and do very little to help society face the challenge. This gets us reflecting on the importance of focusing on what we're good at. And this is the first mistake we really need to avoid when getting things right on climate change. Don't forget what you're good at. This is a wicked problem, a wide range of difficult interacting challenges that need to be unpicked and taken action on. We all have a part to play, but we need to understand what our role is. 3 organizations that really stood out over the last couple of months, I'd just like to illustrate that point with. LVMH, Louis Vuitton holding company, who make wonderful cosmetics and fragrances. They were one of the first to jump in and respond to this challenge. They could convert their existing factories, their existing production line to produce medical grade hand sanitizer that could really help make a difference in their French hospitals. Interestingly to notice how they did, or rather didn't, brand the products they created. Louis Vuitton is all about living life well, but they understood that this product here was to help people live life at all. Brewdog, a brand I love, and a company that has fantastic values, they stepped in up to the plate as well to try and contribute. My feeling with them is they reached just a touch too far in attempting to convert their production line to medical grade sanitizer. They didn't quite hit the mark and instead had to donate all of the products that they made to local communities and charitable groups. And yet I wonder if a company that positions itself as the people beers shouldn't have aimed for that contribution in the first place. They got where they needed to be, I think, by chance rather than by design. But also Brewgooder, interesting to put another beer company side by side, a much smaller operation, but also highly purpose-driven. They knew that they didn't have the capacity, the power to create something so direct as hand sanitizer. But nonetheless, they looked at what their strengths were. They looked at what their capabilities were. And they set up a wonderful opportunity for the people who love and enjoy their beer to pass one forward, to buy a beer on behalf of those working on the front line. I think all these companies stepped up and should be proud of the contribution they made. But it's important to reflect that when purpose is involved, we need to think about not only what it is the world needs and the challenge it faces, but what we can contribute, and reflect carefully and closely on the capabilities we have and how those intersect with the cause that's playing out in front of us. When it comes to climate change, then, there's a few rules of thumb, a few heuristics that can guide us. Number one, very simple, do what you're good at. If you can act, act. But if you can't act directly, you can still help those who can. Find yourself that supporting role. And second, of course, what is that role? Know that you are not the hero. This is not about Louis Vuitton swinging to the rescue. This is not about Brew-Gooder tackling the climate or the coronavirus, but it's about them supporting those who can. And the question then is this really a brandable moment? How should your brand show up when the hero really isn't necessarily you? It's your stakeholders and your customers around you. So that's number one. We need everybody's contribution. Just don't forget what you're good at. Number two, what else did we see in those last couple of months that we can learn from? Well, we saw people coming together to support one another. We did not see a decline into a prehistoric apocalypse. We saw people express love and compassion for those around them, whether that was food baskets for those in need, or our weekly ritual of applauding the NHS at 8 o'clock on a Thursday, as well as family homes across the nation showing their support and their solidarity with the beautiful rainbows in their windows. We saw what can happen in a crisis. People can come together and collaborate. And this is where we need to take on a second issue. Don't forget where you belong. This is the other source of mistakes around communication, around climate change. This sense of belonging when it's not present. We live in a world now with many companies detached from any nation, detached from any place, many of whom don't own the factories, the fields, or the shelves where their products reach real people and real places. But those are where the impacts of climate change will be felt, just like the impacts of the virus. It's interesting to reflect on the challenges Airbnb have had over the last couple of weeks. They, like everybody in the tourism sector, has struggled with a dramatic and unprecedented loss in demand. They've had to let people go. But interestingly, in the CEO's letter, is some deep reflections on what the organization is there before. And he is calling for a return to their roots, a reconnection with the places that they exist, remembering that they were there to bring people together, to make connections and support hosts around the world, rather than to raise rents in city centers and push local people out. So a return to belonging, a return to place by Airbnb is exactly what we need to see to navigate through these crises and challenge. And I'd suggest to get authentic communications on climate change right, we need to start from the right place. The traditional, historic mode that business has been communicating out is this mindset of ownership, a fact of who we are owned by, this sense of legal duty to a distant shareholder. But communications, engagement needs to come from a place of feeling and a sense of belonging. Belonging is different. It's about a connection to people and a connection to place. It's about our fraternal duty, not our fiduciary duty, our connection to one another as brothers and sisters, belonging to places around the world in reality. And that's what we need to avoid to get communications right when it comes to climate change. Connect to real people and real places. This will guide you, getting the tone right, getting the message right, getting the action right. Don't forget where you belong. Number three, okay. Again, what has the last couple of months taught us? Well, it's taught us some interesting differences between transparency and honesty. I think we can safely say there have been some genuine attempts to help us all understand and figure out what on earth has been going on. I think it's also fair to say there's been some misdirection, some fuzz, some clouds to misdirect us from the reality of whether or not people are in control of what's going on around us. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on when it comes to climate, a topic that's full of science, data, information, and graphs. And I think we need to remember not to confuse transparency for honesty. Two things that sound quite close, but are critically different. Example I'd like to use for this is one we worked on last year with the fantastic F1, something we're very proud of, helping them get a full sustainability plan in place, the first one in their history, and commit to being carbon neutral by the end of this decade. What was really interesting, digging down into the statistics and the numbers here, is that most people would expect or assume perhaps that the real carbon impact are those noisy fast cars racing around the track. But actually, an analysis shows that less than 1% of Formula One's carbon impact comes from those vehicles. And really, the biggest impact comes from moving them, shipping them from track to track, and flying those teams from race to race. So what does that mean for F1? Well, they'll be transparent on that fact, and they'll have to make a difference across the range. But it doesn't mean that the cars are beyond action. In fact, they're going to be front and center as part of the strategy. Why? Because they have an outsized power to influence hearts and minds on what the future of transportation is. The key thing with F1 is to be honest about that and say that although the cars are getting cleaner and greener, the reality of emissions for them is this wider picture. And so we've got to be clear, to be authentic on climate change, getting the balance right between transparency and honesty as we go. What's the difference? Well, transparency might mean getting lots of information available. We've all seen those annual reports with hundreds of pages of data that no one can be bothered to read. But honesty is about the valuable information being available, having access to the things that are going to help us make a decision and understand the reality as it pertains to us. Transparency can be another way of providing misdirection and distraction from those things that matter. But honesty directly responds to our stakeholders' needs and supports them. With transparency, small progress can appear big because it's the only number available. Whereas with honesty, small progress appears small because it's given the context it needs for others to understand it. And with transparency, omitted data, those things we can't measure, the things that are too hard to capture, can too easily be glossed over. But when it comes to honesty, we have to explain that and explain how we're going to close those gaps. If you'd like some more on this, you can download the Honest Product Guide from the Futera website, and we've got forthcoming things on how to apply it across fashion, across cosmetics, and more industries down the line. So there's a resource there for you to explore if this is a pain point for your company. But when it comes to this challenge, we need to communicate empowering information and not confuse transparency for honesty. Great. Mistake number 4. What else did we learn from the challenge, from the crisis? Well, we saw different countries deal with the challenge very differently. From the UK, we looked over to our Swedes, our sensible Swedish neighbours, and wondered what was going on there. We looked at New Zealand, perhaps with a little jealousy at their ambitiousness on tackling the challenge. And we looked, along with many, at America with despair. But it's important to remember that this virus didn't just meet different people in different places. It's intersected and interacted with different cultures and different value sets. And people have risen to the challenge in different ways. I think that's important for understanding how we communicate on climate change too. We must remember not to forget what else we value. Yes, we want a green, sustainable future with a stable climate, but it's not the only thing we care about. And we need to find that way of balancing our other values so that we don't get into the sorts of problems we've seen with many nations trying to communicate clearly on all the things that are important to them. We took this challenge on last year with the wonderful and world famous UCL University in London. They wanted a message on sustainability, but one that talked about their wider values, their history and heritage as a radical, status quo challenging organization. Set up to push forward the wonderful philosophies of Jeremy Bentham, UCL was one of the first to allow people of different faiths to study together, and again really led the way on allowing men and women to study together too. This real pioneering spirit, this disruptive approach was key to capture in their message around climate change and inviting people to change possible, to be bold, to be ambitious, and to challenge the status quo. So it's important to remember that there are multiple values that need to come together when we tackle climate change. The wonderful work by Jonathan Haidt is a guidebook to understanding those you disagree with and who infuriate you. But it's also a fantastic foundation for really thinking about the future that we want. Haidt identifies 6 different moral tastes. That's the weird tongue-hand side of this slide. These are morality elements, are available, are there, exist in all of us, but they matter in different degrees and different quantities, depending on who we are and what culture we're part of. Understanding these different values, care, fairness, loyalty, liberty, authority, and sanctity, can give us a guide to painting a rich picture of the climate future we want. Here then, when we think about climate change and we think about a vision of the future we'd like to build towards, are half a dozen different stories of a sustainable goal that we could work towards. You might be familiar already with a sense of climate justice, this story about solving our problems while at the same time unleashing compassion for the marginalized in our society. But there are other stories too available to us. There's climate liberty, which we often hear about. This sense to empower people to determine their own fate when it comes to climate change, to empower local solutions, such as community energy, for example. Then there's climate action, the story about privileging science and rationality to solve this technical solution that we face. Climate nationalism comes in too, a sense of preserving a country or a people against this impending threat to the security or stability of the nation. There's also a story of climate control, a real desire to have power over nature, to do away with the uncertainty by retaking control of climate change. And I think that echoes very much the sort of narrative we have around coronavirus at the moment. But we've also another message, climate wisdom, this story about protecting the sanctity of the natural world and allowing it to heal, remembering elder wisdom from previous ages. Now, it's not to say that any one of these is necessarily right and wrong, but they do conflict. It's hard to have climate justice and climate nationalism at the same time. It's not always easy to prioritize the needs of the marginalized overseas while preserving and protecting and doing what's right for your own country here. Liberty and control can be in contrast too, as can the desire to listen to the ancient wisdom of bygone ages and the impulse to privilege rationality and science and technological solutions. The challenge for you is to know which one really applies to your business, your values, and your culture. What is that fuller climate story for you? Where are you prepared to compromise to get to a sustainable future? And what other values are you not prepared to compromise on? Be clear on the future you want. Don't forget what else you value. Okay, number 5. So finally, one more thought on what we saw in the last couple of months. Some people tried to tell us that we were all in this together. However, the headlines seem to tell a very different story. We saw different groups suffering more acutely to the virus. Whether it was men across the world being more susceptible and more likely to die, or specific socioeconomic groups who were more likely to be exposed to and run the risk of catching the virus in the first place. At the same time, we saw those who profited greatly from the situation, and others, rich and safe in their havens, come with hands outstretched to collect the bailouts for their climate challenging businesses. What's our reflection here? It's important to not forget how your success is going to be achieved. Don't forget how you succeed. It really matters. If we're to get to this future, we need to take on the challenge of growth and think about how growth applies to our business if we're to have an authentic story on climate change. I'd like to reflect on the wonderful and enigmatic Microsoft and how they've changed their purpose over recent years. It shows two examples of how growth can be in service to society. On the left-hand side, we have their old purpose, a computer on every desk and in every home. And on the right-hand side, a new one, to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. These are two very different ideas about how the company's success aligns with the success of the world around them. In the early days, it was growth, it was expansion, a growth of getting bigger that was going to serve society's needs, making this wonderful technology accessible to the many. But today, it's a different challenge. It's about enabling people to create change. It's that supporting role. And instead of just growing bigger and bigger and bigger, it's about growing more sophisticated, more complex, and more capable. These are the two stories that are available around growth and service to society. And you need to understand how the success of your business aligns with the success of the wider world around you if you're to be authentic on your climate change communications. Because if you don't, you'll have one part of your business talking about how important climate change is and another part of your business dodging EU emissions standards. Grow bigger on the left-hand side. There's nothing necessarily wrong with growing your company bigger. We need a lot of industries to grow and to scale. We need disruptors with better ideas to reach bigger audiences. We need technologies to roll out on the scale that they're going to create social change. But there are other things that we no longer need to keep growing and growing and enhancing and enhancing. Instead, if that's your business, you need to be thinking about how you're going to become more sophisticated as an organization. How do you serve society through skill, through your own competence, and improving that? And there are two different mindsets in these two different organizations. If your service is by growing bigger, your focus is going to be on efficiency, doing as much as possible to expand your contribution to society. If your business is about growing more sophisticated, you need a mindset of sufficiency, doing as much as necessary to solve the challenges that society faces. This is our final challenge. Know how your growth serves the planet. Don't forget that how you succeed matters. And when you communicate from this starting point, you'll get authentic messaging on climate change. So here are the five. A recap. 1, we need everybody's contribution. Just don't forget what you're good at. Climate change is going to throw us all sorts of challenges, all sorts of crises, and everybody's got some part to play along the way. Just avoid those bandwagons and play to your strengths. Number 2, real connection to people and place will guide you. Don't forget where you belong. Yes, this is a global challenge. Yes, carbon emitted in one country affects climate change on a planetary scale, but the impacts will be felt by real people in real places. And if you're not connected to them, you won't communicate authentically. Number 3, communicate empowering information. Don't confuse transparency for honesty. Climate change is a complex topic. It's full of data, science, graphs, targets and goals. It's not just enough to put these out into the world. You need to help time-poor, overloaded people navigate and find the information they need to make an informed judgment. Number 4, be clear on the future you want. Don't forget what else you value. If we create a sustainable, a climate stable world where there's no freedom, there's no joy, everything that we value in our tradition and our heritage is gone and destroyed, nature is submitted and lost under railway tracks, then have we really created the future that we want? Know what else you stand for, and be prepared to defend it along the way. And then finally, the big challenge: know how your growth, how your success serves the planet. That's the only way you're going to be welcomed. It's the only way you're going to communicate authentically on climate change, without people turning around and saying, oh, they would say that, but really all they want to do is shift more product. Don't forget, how you succeed matters. Thank you all very much. That is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining in. I can see there's a few questions in the Q&A. I'll tell you what, I will leave it on this slide. So we've got the 5 in front of us, and I will click on the Q&A now and have a look at what some of the questions are that we've got. Okay, here we are. So 3 questions. First one here from Sharon Brunt. Thank you for this. If a brand wants to go from business as normal to a sustainable business, what sort of timescale should they be thinking of to get there? How many phases? Difficult to answer, but in general terms. Wonderful question, Sharon. And I think at Futera, one of the ways we think about this is there are 2 types of businesses in the world. There are the born good and the born again. The born good are those who are started with a sense of purpose, a sense of social impact at their heart. And for them, they've often got this sort of thing built in, and it's just about tweaking and adjusting and really seeing where they can make a difference. But for those others, for those born agains, it can be a difficult transition, and it can be something that takes a bit of time. You can achieve a remarkable amount in 6 months of getting things going, but it will often take a few years to really embed a new direction and really change a culture. That's a short answer. I hope that helps give you a rough rule of thumb. Bobby asks, what tools would you suggest very early stage startups to determine how to measure or maximize their environmental impact? Thanks, Bobby, and it's a good question. I think the first piece of advice I'd give you is to focus. Really thinking about that top question about what is everybody's contribution, how you can make a difference. The key thing here is to say, well, if you're a startup, you need to act lean. And you've probably only got so much time and effort that you can put into measuring these sorts of things. There's a process called materiality. And if you have a sort of Google of that and get a sense of what materiality is all about, it'll help you understand that there's really, every business has a few key activities that, where they make an outsized social environmental impact. And I'd recommend you use that as an initial tool to focus on just a few areas where you can create a real difference. Sharon's asked contribution rather than growth. I think this is an interesting space and a long conversation to be had exploring that. I think we do need to lean into growth as a topic and a question. And every business needs to ask itself, why do we deserve to grow? How does our growth serve society around us? Let's have a look at the next one. Robert, I'm trying to start an ecotourism business. How can I be as honest as I like? But should I, I can be as honest as I like. Or should I just accept that however many trees I plant, however many minds I influence, it'll never really be better than customers not incurring the mileage to get there in the first place. Basically, are necessary evils still evil? Thanks, Robert. One of the things we think about at Futera is the difference between brainprint and footprint. And your question there touches on both of those. You talk about your environmental impact, your footprint, but you also talk about those minds you influence, that brainprint. And the fact is, you know, we live in a wonderful moment in time. Air travel allows us to see the wonders of the world and explore and discover people like us all over different societies and cultures. It's a wonderful thing, but I think you're absolutely right. There are some inherent challenges here. I think, Robert, you can, of course, only do so much as one organization, but I'd encourage you to see what other groups and wider movements you can be part of. Slow travel, for example, is a really interesting space, and one that I don't think we've seen the last of. As working patterns change, as technologies like this get ever better, why would we keep this sort of holiday periods of 1 or 2 weeks a year where we switch off from everything and disappear? Why not start our journeys with a sort of work rest technique, moving steadily by train and bus and boat across a continent over the course of a month? The technology is there, the potential's there, but is the behavior yet? So I'd say, Robert, keep thinking big, keep challenging the status quo, and join with others to have that outsized impact. More questions coming in. Wonderful. George, hi, thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much, George. Wondering, what are your best recommended books to learn more about climate change, as well as climate change entrepreneurship? Ah, wonderful, great challenge. And there is a wonderful, extensive library to be explored. I wish I had a good resource for you. George, one of the things I'd suggest is something that I'm really reading and enjoying recently. There's been a lot digging down into the economics of climate change. And I think from an entrepreneur's perspective, from a business-minded perspective, reading the books from those who are trying to square that circle of how do we make a prosperous society that also is one that lives within nature's limits, is a really good place to dig down into climate change. So 2 I would suggest to get you started, if you haven't read them all already, is Donut Economics, which looks at a very interesting model to try and take that on. And another is Prosperity Without Growth. Again, 2 ideas really challenging how business and economies can solve the climate challenge. So that would be a great place for an entrepreneur to get started. Coming up for business information. From my experience, the organizational culture change is the real bottleneck, as it requires much more work than business as usual. Do you have any suggestions or incentives that would inspire urgency for business leaders? And I'll just speed up because I notice we're slightly coming to the end of time, but it's a good question. And I think you're absolutely right. You've put your finger on the button here. When we create purposes for our clients, when we look at embedding purpose within a business, there are 2 realms in which we explore, hard and soft. The soft realm is culture and values and trying to get that aligned. But the hard realm is just as important. And that's where we look at business strategy, governance, metrics, and performance. One of the ways you can really drive change within a business is by aligning what do you measure and what do you incentivize. And it can be hard. You can have as many moving and uplifting speeches from the CEO as you like. But if your average middle manager is still incentivized to buy it cheap and stack it high without considering any wider impacts, then you won't get the change you need. So my real suggestion there is to do both the hard and the soft measures at the same time. Yes, try and change culture and all the good things with that, town halls, away days, team building exercises, bringing people in to build your values and live them and understand them. Yes, but unless you do the hard, you won't get the change you need. Incentivize, reward, and structure your business to deliver on your purpose too. Another comment, final comments here. I think that innovation should be taken into account for the link to growth and sustainable responsibility. Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. Wonderful. And that's one way, of course, that your growth, that your contribution could really make a difference. What type of business are you? Are you one here that is to serve a very specific need? Or are you more of a disruptor? Is your role not necessarily to serve society, but to shake it up and show it what else is possible, to innovate and explore a new direction? Find your own vibe, find your own energy, and live it to the full. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. And I think that is the end of the session. Good luck. Take care. All the very best.